But before that, I was just curious if you had any thoughts to describe Barfield's influence in the Inklings development, but also longer standing influence on wider Western society.
Yeah, so his influence in terms of the Inklings would have been the greatest on Lewis, for sure. Lewis was the strongest connection he had to the group. And you always get the sense from Lewis's letters that he really admired Barfield very deeply. He calls him, of course, the wisest and the best of his unofficial teachers. He says he towers above us all. And he was just constant in his affection for him. There was a real love there. That being said, Lewis couldn't go along with Barfield's anthroposophy, but it didn't seem to diminish his respect for Barfield. In one letter, he writes about how he has a few friends who follow what he calls the doctrines of Rudolf Steiner, and he says those doctrines are erroneous, and that he's frequently engaged in controversy with his friends on the subject. But he says, that being the case, I've never detected even a shred of intellectual or ethical diminishment as a result of their beliefs. And I kind of love that, right? That ability to have mutual respect in spite of difference. I think that's something we could all use a lot more of today.
Here, here.
Yeah, so Barfield and Lewis are, in a way, a beautiful model of that. I think in terms of Tolkien, yeah, Barfield had some influence on Tolkien, which isn't surprising given that Tolkien was a philologist. Tolkien apparently told Lewis once that he was never able to lecture on certain topics after he'd read Poetic Diction without recalling some of Barfield's ideas about ancient semantic unity that he said modified my whole outlook on language. And that would force him to kind of check what he was about to say in a lecture. In terms of Charles Williams, I don't think Barfield had any influence whatsoever on Williams. But it's interesting to me that Williams is the one who probably has the most in common with Barfield out of all the main four. Barfield told Humphrey Carpenter once that he may have found some common philosophical or theological ground with Williams if they had ever had the chance to talk alone and at length. But unfortunately, Williams died pretty young and they just never got the chance. But it's pretty clear from Barfield's work that he later read quite a bit of Williams, actually, and incorporates some references in a few of his books, including Eager Spring. So we'll get to that. But yeah, Stephen Dunning has written about this in detail because he interviewed Barfield in the summer of 1986, and Barfield told him the same story he'd related to Carpenter, which is such a funny story about how Barfield and Williams first met. Apparently, Williams just burst into the room, as he did, without knowing anything about Barfield or that he was a disciple of Steiner. And so he burst into the room and announced, I've just been talking to somebody who accused me of being an anthroposophist. Yeah, I would say that Barfield seems to be intrigued by a few of Williams's key ideas, like coherence. And so, like I said, he mentions him, I think, in Saving the Appearance, in Unancestral Voice. And he definitely read Descent of the Dove, which is probably the work of theology Williams is most known for today in a lot of circles. I think to touch on the second part of your question, asking about the influence of Barfield on the wider society, it makes me think of an argument that Barfield's biographer, Simon Blaxland Delange, has made, where he says that a quality which the other Inklings did not, by and large, share with Barfield was his passionate concern, not merely with visionary ideas, but with their implementation. And Barfield himself commented once that he didn't think any of the Inklings had any real interest in society as a whole. He says, Lewis never read a single newspaper or anything of that sort. He says, I don't think Tolkien did. He says, Charles Williams, I'm not sure. He was more wide awake to the world than the other two. But he says, oh, but I didn't know him very well. And I don't know how fair that is, given that the other Inklings did impact the world in such real ways, although, of course, they were primarily artists. So they impacted the world through their imaginative writing. And so, yeah, they weren't social activists, but I don't think that means they didn't have an interest in society or that, I mean, for instance, Lewis, I don't think in an ideal world he would have chosen to spend his time doing those BBC talks that involved him taking the train to London. But he felt it mattered to his society living in wartime Britain. So Barfield can sometimes be dismissive of Lewis's public work as a lay theologian because he had so little interest in that kind of apologetics or devotional work. But I think probably from our point of view, that was work worth doing. And I don't think we would be alone in feeling that way. So I also think about how, with the benefit of hindsight, we know now that Tolkien has had an enormous influence on the development of the post-war modern environmental movement. And more Tolkien scholarship is taking this up and seeing Lord of the Rings as a text that really ushered in a new ecological awakening.
Mhm.
So I think the extent to which Barfield himself has impacted the wider world in the way he wanted is still uncertain. I think about a story that my good friend Matthew Steam told. He's the editor in chief of Radix magazine, and he recently interviewed Barfield's grandson, Owen Barfield, who I know you've recently spoken to as well.
Yes.
And and Owen Barfield the younger tells a story about helping his grandfather pack up some of the things in his house as he was preparing to move. And he recalls Barfield sat down at one point and kind of sighed and said, "It will be 50 years before my work is understood." And so this was in the mid 80s, 1985, which meant he was speaking about the time we're in right now. And I love that story, and I suspect that Barfield is probably right about his own legacy, that it would take a while. And it's interesting to me that, like, although he thought his work would find an audience eventually, he was pretty skeptical that this audience would be primarily academic.